The morning Marcus had me escorted out of our own company's boardroom, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood in the marble lobby of the Pearson Financial Tower in downtown Toronto, watching the elevator doors close on his face, and I thought, he has no idea what he just did. It was a Wednesday in October, the kind of gray, bone-cold morning that comes early in Ontario and never really apologizes for itself. I had driven in from Oakville at 6:30, same as I had every day for 11 years. Coffee in my thermos, the 403 already clogged with headlights. The meeting was scheduled for 8. A merger discussion with Kellaway Capital, a deal I had spent 4 months building from a cold introduction at a conference in Vancouver to a signed letter of intent on my kitchen table at midnight. My kitchen table, my introduction. My 4 months. Marcus had called me the night before, just after 10. His voice was the easy, warm version he used when he needed something. Listen, Claire, I've been thinking about optics for tomorrow. The Kellaway guys are old school. I want it to feel tight. Just me and Derek in the room. I had held the phone against my ear and listened to the silence that followed, and I said, "That's fine, Marcus." Because I always said that. Because I had been saying that for 11 years. What I did not say was that I had built the model. I had drafted the terms. I had spent 3 phone calls coaching Marcus on Kellaway's founder, Alan Bryce, his priorities, his concerns about post-merger culture, the fact that his late wife had been a financial analyst and that he responded instinctively to people who spoke her language. I had handed Marcus every key, and he had pocketed them without looking up. Standing in that lobby, I pulled my coat tighter and walked out into the cold. A streetcar hummed past on King Street. Somewhere across the city, in a glass room on the 22nd floor, my husband was shaking Alan Bryce's hand and taking credit for the work that had kept us solvent through 2 recessions, a pandemic year, and a restructuring that should have killed the company but didn't because I had found the bridge financing. Because I had renegotiated the lease on our Calgary office at 3 in the morning while Marcus slept. I got in my car and I sat there for a long time. Not crying. Thinking. My name is Claire Ashworth. I am 41 years old. I have a commerce degree from Queen's University and an MBA from Rotman, which I completed part-time while running the operational side of Ashworth Meridian Consulting because Marcus thought a full-time program would pull me away from the business. I said that was fine too. For 11 years I had been the person who made sure things worked. Not in any small sense, I mean, the contracts, the client relationships, the financial models, the vendor agreements. I was the one who flew to Edmonton on a Friday in February when our largest energy client threatened to pull out, sat across from their CFO in a boardroom that smelled like old coffee, and talked him off the ledge with a restructured service agreement I wrote on the flight. I was the one who noticed, in 2019, that our accounts payable structure had a gap that would have cost us $200,000 in penalties if left another 6 months. I found it. I fixed it. I mentioned it to Marcus, who nodded and moved on without writing it down. He was good at the front of the room. I will give him that. Marcus had the kind of confidence that filled a space before he spoke tall. Silver at the temples now, the firm handshake that Bay Street still rewards. Clients liked him. He told a good story. He remembered birthdays. He also could not read a balance sheet without my summary notes, and he had not written a proposal from scratch since 2017, though his name appeared at the top of every one. I had accepted this arrangement for a long time because I told myself it was a partnership. That the company belonged to both of us. That his success was my success. I had believed that in the way you believe things that feel too painful to examine closely. The lobby incident was not the first sign. There had been the Ottawa conference in 2022, where Marcus had presented a growth strategy I had written to an audience of 300 people and introduced it as something I've been developing. There had been the annual review meeting with our accountant, Pierre, where Marcus had described our pivot away from government contracts as his strategic instinct, a pivot I had argued for in writing, and with projections, for 8 months before he agreed. There had been the dinner with his sister in Montreal, where he had said, without looking at me, "Claire handles the administrative side," when his sister asked what I did at the firm. Administrative side. But it was the lobby that morning that made something go quiet inside me. A very specific kind of quiet. The kind that comes not from defeat but from decision. I drove home to Oakville. I made a second coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had built the Kellaway deal, and I opened my laptop. What I had that Marcus did not understand was access. Not just knowledge, though I had that too. I mean structural access. I was the signatory on 3 of our major vendor contracts. My name, not his, was on the master service agreement with Thornfield Analytics, which provided the data infrastructure for our 2 most profitable practice areas. I had negotiated those agreements personally, and the renewal clauses named me as the primary contact. I held the relationship with our anchor client, Devereaux Group, through their VP of Operations, a woman named Sandra Cho, who I had known since graduate school and who had trusted us with their business specifically because of me. I also knew, because I had been managing it quietly for 2 years, that there was a problem with our Westfield partnership, a revenue-sharing agreement Marcus had signed without reading carefully, which entitled Westfield to a larger percentage of any deal that crossed a value threshold we were now regularly exceeding. I had flagged it twice. Both times, Marcus had said he'd have his lawyer look at it. He never did. The exposure was now, on my most recent estimate, somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 if Westfield ever decided to exercise it. I did not create that problem. But I had been the only person who knew its full shape. I opened a new document and I started writing. Not a plan for revenge. I want to be careful about that word, because what I was doing did not feel like revenge. It felt like accounting. A very long overdue reconciliation of what I had given and what I had received, and what I intended to do about the difference. The first thing I did was call Sandra Cho. We had lunch the following week at a place on Front Street she liked, and over ahi tuna and a glass of Niagara Chardonnay, I told her that I was considering my options. I didn't need to say much more than that. Sandra was a smart woman. She asked me 2 questions and then she said, "Whatever you decide, Claire, the relationship is with you." I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and a clarity in my chest I hadn't felt in years. The second thing I took longer to do, because I needed to be deliberate. The Thornfield contract renewal was coming up in January. I reached out to Thornfield's account manager, someone I had worked with for 3 years, and I asked for a preliminary renewal conversation. I framed it as routine. It was not routine. I was laying groundwork, quietly, without drama, the way I had always worked in the background, where no one was watching. Marcus, meanwhile, was celebrating the Kellaway deal. The signing dinner was at Canoe, the restaurant at the top of the TD Tower. The kind of place that costs $400 a person, and exists specifically for these moments. He invited me, which I suppose was something. I wore a navy dress and sat beside Alan Bryce's associate and listened to Marcus give a toast that mentioned my contribution in the way someone mentions the weather briefly, as context, before moving on to the real subject. Alan Bryce caught my eye across the table during the toast. He had the look of a man who had been in rooms like this for 40 years and could read them perfectly. He nodded, very slightly. I nodded back. In the weeks that followed, I paid close attention to the Westfield situation. Marcus had begun the first phase of Kellaway integration, which was exactly the kind of complex operational work he consistently underestimated. He was leaning heavily on Derek, our operations manager, who was competent but not experienced at this scale. I watched from a careful distance as small misalignments started to appear, timeline estimates that didn't account for the due diligence requirements, a client communication sequence that had gaps in it, a regulatory filing for the Ontario Securities Commission that needed specific language I had used before and Derek had not. I did not fix these things. That is the part I have to sit with. For the first time in 11 years, I let things go without intervening. Not sabotage, I did not create the problems. I simply stopped being the invisible hand that caught everything before it fell. Marcus noticed, in the distracted way he noticed most things. He stopped by my home office one evening in November. We had been sleeping in the same house but existing in different atmospheres since October, and he said the Kellaway integration was getting complicated. He said it the way he said most things that were actually requests. As a statement, aimed in my direction, waiting for me to step forward. I asked him what specifically was complicated. He said the OSC filing timelines were tighter than expected. I said that sounded difficult. He waited. I went back to what I was reading. He left the room with the particular silence of a man who has always assumed the floor would rise to meet him and is beginning to suspect it might not. December moved quickly. I had a conversation with a woman I'll call Nina, a former colleague who had left our firm 4 years earlier to start her own practice in financial consulting. Nina had been asking me for 2 years, casually, whether I had ever thought about going independent. In early December, over coffee at a place in Mississauga, I told her I had been thinking about it seriously. We talked for 3 hours. I drove home with pages of notes and something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a future that was actually mine. The Westfield issue surfaced in the second week of January. A letter from Westfield's legal team, which arrived by email on a Tuesday morning, noting that based on the Q4 close, several deals had exceeded the threshold and they were exercising the revenue-sharing clause. The total claim was $312,000. Marcus called me into the kitchen. We had moved past pretending the home office interactions were normal, and he set his laptop on the counter with the email open and looked at me. I looked at the email. I looked at him. I flagged this in March of last year, I said. And in August. I know, he said. I should have dealt with it. You should have, I said. He ran a hand through his hair. He had aged in the past 3 months, I noticed it clearly now. Not badly, just visibly, in the way that pressure ages people who have never had to carry it alone before. I need to figure out the Thornfield renewal at the same time, he said. Derek says the terms are complicated. The terms are fine, I said. I wrote them. He looked at me, then actually looked at me, the way he had not in a long time. Not with love exactly, but with something more useful, recognition. I can't do this without you, Claire. It was not quite an apology. But it was the truest thing he had said to me in years. I had imagined this moment differently. In the version I had constructed in my head during those early weeks, I had imagined feeling triumphant. Some hot satisfaction, a score being settled. What I actually felt, standing in my kitchen in January in Oakville, was something quieter and more interesting than that. I felt clear. I had earned this moment not by breaking anything but by simply stepping back and letting the truth of the situation become visible. Marcus, I said, and I kept my voice even, you have relied on my work to run this company for 11 years. You presented my deal to Alan Bryce without me in the room. You've introduced me as administrative staff at your own firm. You signed a contract you didn't read and left me to manage the exposure for 2 years while telling me you'd handle it. He opened his mouth. I'm not finished, I said. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and because it needs to be said out loud at least once. I paused. I've spoken with Sandra Cho. I've had preliminary conversations with Thornfield. I'm going to be leaving the firm. The color left his face. The Devereaux account, I continued, is mine. Sandra has made that clear. That's 30% of our billings. The Thornfield renewal will be contingent on my involvement in whatever structure comes next, and I will be negotiating that as an independent contractor. I had rehearsed none of this. It came out level and clean because I had been thinking it clearly for 3 months. I'm not trying to destroy what you've built. I'm establishing what I've built, which is not the same thing. Claire? You can handle Westfield, I said. Pierre knows the file. It's manageable. I had, quietly, prepared a summary of the Westfield exposure with 3 resolution options and left it in a shared folder he had access to. Not because he deserved the favor. Because the employees of the firm, the junior consultants and the office coordinator and Derek, did not deserve to pay for his mistakes. He stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after I walked out. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and I listened to the house, which was the same house I had lived in for 9 years and which felt, that evening, genuinely like a place I could leave. I want to be honest about the months that followed, because they were not simple. Starting something from scratch at 41, even with strong client relationships and a clear professional reputation, is not easy. There were weeks in the late winter where I sat at my new desk in a small leased office in Burlington 12 minutes from home, a window that looked out over the escarpment, and wondered if I had miscalculated. There was a version of this story where I stayed, where I made my peace, where I kept managing the invisible architecture of someone else's success because it was familiar and the alternative was uncertain. But Sandra Cho brought Devereaux over formally in February, and the contract was in my name, my company's name, which I had registered in November. Ashworth Advisory Incorporated. And Thornfield renewed through me in March, a straightforward arrangement that acknowledged what had always been true. That the relationship was mine. By April I had 2 additional clients, one a referral from Alan Bryce himself, who had called me in February and said, with his characteristic directness, I wondered when you'd stop carrying that firm for him. Marcus called twice in February. The first time I answered. He said he was working through the Westfield settlement and that things were stable. He said he missed having me around. I said I was glad things were stable. There was a long pause and he said, "I didn't see how much of it was you." I said I knew. I said I hoped the next chapter of the firm went well, and I meant it. Not warmly, not coldly, just cleanly. The second call I let go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear what it said. There is a particular freedom in building something where every decision is yours. I had not known, until I had it, how much weight I had been carrying that was not mine to carry. The exhaustion of invisibility of pouring your competence into a shape that wore someone else's name. I had done it for 11 years, and I had done it, I think, partly because it was easier to be indispensable behind the scenes than to be vulnerable in front of them. Starting my own firm meant my name was on the line. My calls, my pitches, my reputation. That was frightening. It was also, in a way I hadn't expected, the first time in a long time that I felt like myself. By June, Ashworth Advisory had 3 full clients and 2 active proposals. I had hired 1 part-time analyst, a young woman from McMaster who reminded me of who I had been at 26. Careful, fast. Completely underestimated. I paid her well. I told her which meetings she was essential to. I made sure her name was on the work she did. The lesson I carried out of those 11 years was not about Marcus, specifically. It was about what happens when you make yourself so quietly essential that you become invisible when you solve every problem before anyone else knows it existed, when you translate your intelligence into someone else's confidence, when you stop putting your name on your own work because the collaboration feels like enough. It isn't enough. It was never enough. I had waited for Marcus to see me. For 11 years, in various forms, that had been the quiet hope underneath everything. What I understood now, sitting in my Burlington office in June with the escarpment light coming through the window and a signed engagement letter on my desk, was that the waiting itself had been the problem. I had been watching a door that was never going to open from his side. I had to open my own door. It turns out I'd had the key the whole time. The firm Marcus had built on the foundation of my work still existed. He had managed the Westfield settlement without catastrophe. He had brought in a new operations lead who, by all accounts, was competent. The Kellaway integration had taken longer than projected and cost more than budgeted, but it had closed. He was, by any reasonable measure, fine. And so was I. Better than fine, actually. Freer and more focused and more genuinely satisfied in my work than I had been in longer than I could honestly remember. Not because I had taken anything from him, because I had finally stopped giving away what was mine. Someone asked me recently, at a Women in Finance event in Hamilton, whether I regretted staying as long as I did. I thought about it carefully before I answered, the way I try to do with questions that deserve it. I said no. Not because those years were without cost, they were not. But because everything I learned about how businesses actually run, how to hold client relationships through difficulty, how to read a room that doesn't know you're reading it, I learned in those years. I built the skills that built my firm while I was busy making someone else's company work. The only thing I would have changed was simpler than any of that. I would have put my name on my work sooner. I would have said, years earlier, in rooms full of clients and colleagues. I built this. Not to diminish anyone else. Just because it was true. And because it turns out, when you finally say it out loud, the world is not nearly as surprised as you expected.